Ridicule cuts deepest when it falls from the mouth of your own blood. Alva stood there, perfectly still, while his relatives tore into him over what they deemed a worthless inheritance. They called him desperate, called him foolish, a naive dreamer clutching at barren soil. What none of those sneering relatives understood, the real joke lay buried 30 feet beneath their contempt. Dust motes floated through slanted afternoon light that cut between the blinds of Attorney Charles Lindholm's mahogany-paneled office. The room reeked of aged paper, lemon polish, and the thick, choking tension of greed. Uncle Harrison's will had summoned the entire Gallagher extended family into this cramped downtown Albany space. Every last one of them perched like carrion birds, waiting to tear into a sizable, if eccentric, estate. Elva Caldwell sat near the back wall. His hands rested on the threadbare knees of his corduroy trousers. A middle school history teacher, whose mortgage was a monthly drowning exercise, Alva had never once asked Harrison for money. He had simply loved the man. On the opposite side of the room sat Richard Gallagher, Alva's brother-in-law, tailored Italian suit, hair slicked back like a blade. Everything about him radiated corporate ruthlessness. Richard was married to Alva's sister Beatrice. He had built his fortune gutting distressed assets and selling off the bones. He glanced at his Rolex a third time and exhaled loudly enough for every person in that room to register it. Moving on to the primary real estate assets, Lindholm announced, adjusting his spectacles. To my nephew Alva Caldwell, I leave the entirety of the 50-acre property known as the Ashwood Tract, located in the foothills of Oakhaven County. Silence held the room for exactly one heartbeat. Then Richard cracked, a sharp, barking laugh. The Ashwood Tract? He looked around, making sure every eye was on him. Alva, congratulations. You are now the proud owner of 50 acres of dead limestone, invasive scrub, and toxic soil. I tried to buy that eyesore from Harrison a decade ago. Figured I'd convert it into a landfill. Even the State Environmental Board turned me down. Said the land was too useless for garbage. Beatrice elbowed her husband in the ribs. But she was grinning too. Richard, be nice. Alva has always loved nature. Maybe he can grow, well, rocks. The room erupted. Cousins, aunts, distant nephews, all of them piling onto the laughter. Alva felt that familiar heat crawling up his neck, the deep, spreading flush of humiliation. He stared down at his own hands. Uncle Harrison had been a wealthy man, yet he had left the profitable commercial properties to cousins who barely visited him. The stock portfolios went to Beatrice. And to Alva, his favorite, he had left a literal wasteland. There is a stipulation, Lindholm pressed on, raising his voice above the dying chuckles. Harrison explicitly stated in this codicil that the land must not be sold for a minimum of 5 years. He also wrote a personal note addressed to you. Lindholm slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Alva took it with faintly trembling fingers. He shut out Richard's theatrical groaning about wasting everyone's time and tore open the flap. Inside, scrawled in Harrison's shaky spiderweb handwriting, were 2 sentences. __quote _7 __. The ridicule hit its crescendo the following weekend. The family's annual Thanksgiving dinner held at Richard and Beatrice's sprawling suburban mansion. Alva pulled up in his decade-old sedan, wedging it awkwardly between 2 immaculate German luxury SUVs. His wife, Sarah, took his hand before they crossed toward the grand double doors. Quote 8, quote, she murmured. Quote 9, quote. But ignoring Richard was never possible. The moment everyone settled around the enormous dining table, the Ashwood Tract became the evening's main course. So, Alva, Richard started, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet. Cracked the code on monetizing your Dust Bowl yet? I know a guy at a mining conglomerate. They might throw you a few $100 for the gravel, if you ask real nice. I'm keeping it, Elva said quietly. Eyes fixed on his plate. Harrison wanted me to have it. Harrison was senile, Richard fired back, leaning forward. Aggressive, deliberate. Listen, Alva, I'm doing you a favor here. The property taxes on that wasteland are going to devour you on a teacher's salary. Let me take it off your hands right now. $10,000, cash. You can finally get that transmission fixed on the wreck you drive around in. We'll bypass the 5-year stipulation with a trust transfer. Alva looked up. His eyes narrowed. Richard's voice dripped with mockery, but something predatory had surfaced behind his gaze. Alva said, his voice carried weight this time, __quote _18 __. Richard's smirk died. What replaced it was cold steel. Suit yourself. Don't come crawling to me when the county forecloses on you. The following morning, Alva drove out to Oakhaven County. The Ashwood tract matched every bleak word of its description. Grey limestone jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Dead vegetation twisted across the terrain in every direction. The ground was so dense it refused water, leaving dry, fractured ravines carved across the surface. Standing in the middle of that wind-blown stretch of nothing, Alva felt doubt crash through him like a wave. Had Harrison simply lost his mind in the end? Had he chained his favorite nephew to a financial millstone? Alva walked toward a shallow depression near the center of the acreage. He kicked at the loose shale. His boot didn't produce a dull thud. It produced a sharp, hollow clink. He froze, dropped to his knees, brushed away dirt and loose stone with his bare hands. 6 inches beneath dead soil lay something that didn't belong there. A perfectly smooth, manufactured surface. Not rock. Reinforced industrial concrete. A solid slab of it. And embedded directly in its center was a massive iron ring, rusted dark, thick as a man's arm. His heart slammed against his ribs. Harrison's note echoed through his mind. Dig past the surface. Alva told no one, not even Sarah. The moment he mentioned the mysterious concrete slab, Richard would know. He always knew. Richard had a gift for turning whispers into weaponized legal filings. So Alva spent the next 3 weeks becoming invisible. He took a leave of absence from the middle school, cited stress and exhaustion, and began making daily covert runs to the Ashwood tract. He rented a heavy-duty pickup, purchased an arsenal, shovels, pickaxes, ground-penetrating radar equipment rented under a false name, a commercial-grade angle grinder. The physical cost was savage. Alva, a man built for chalkboards and grading papers, was soon wearing blisters that split and bled, hardening into thick yellow calluses. Every night his muscles burned with a deep, relentless fire. 8 hours a day under punishing sun, scraping dirt away from that slab inch by inch. By the second week's end, the full scope of what lay beneath became clear. It wasn't just a slab. It was a massive circular capstone, 20 feet across, sunk deep into limestone bedrock. The iron ring at its center connected to a complex, heavily corroded mechanical locking system. It resembled the entrance to a missile silo, but the brutalist construction suggested something far older. Stamped into the concrete was a faded insignia, a crossed hammer and railway spike. Surrounding it, the letters VRC. Alva sat at the excavation's edge, dragging a filthy rag across his forehead. He pulled out his phone and called the only person he trusted, Dylan Arris. His old college roommate, now a structural engineer and historical architecture obsessive based in Boston. Dylan arrived 2 days later, stepped out of his Jeep in a pair of clean work boots, took one look at the exposed capstone, let out a low whistle. __quote _21 _____________________________________________________________________ Dylan murmured, sliding down into the dirt trench to examine the rusted locking mechanism. Elva said, tossing him a bottle of water. Dylan traced the faded letters. His eyes went wide. Elva stared at the massive iron ring. Dylan said, his voice shaking with barely contained adrenaline. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. While Elva and Dylan began prepping to breach the vault, a very different operation was unfolding in the city. Richard Gallagher sat rigid in his corner office. A satellite printout of the Ashwood tract lay flat on the desk before him. Across from him waited his private investigator, the polished, shadow-dwelling man named Victor Lawson. ____quote _29_____. Lawson said, sliding a stack of grainy surveillance photos across the mahogany. ____quote _30_____. Richard studied the images. His jaw went tight. He had always suspected Uncle Harrison was concealing something. Years earlier, Richard had intercepted a letter meant for Harrison. It came from a geological surveyor. It referenced a high-density subterranean anomaly beneath the Oakhaven property. Richard assumed it meant an untapped vein, rare earth minerals. Maybe natural gas. So he played the long game. Let the old man die, swoop in, acquire the land for nothing. What he never once imagined was Harrison leaving everything to the idiot history teacher. Richard hissed. His fist cracked against the desk. Lawson asked, his tone flat and clinical. Richard sneered. He pulled out his phone. ___quote _36____. Back at the site, the sun was sinking low. Long, bloody shadows stretched across the dead landscape. Alva and Dylan had anchored the hydraulic winch to the reinforced frame of Dylan's Jeep. A thick steel cable ran taut from the winch drum to the central iron ring embedded in the capstone. Sparks showered down into the trench as Alva drove the angle grinder through the last of the century-old steel hinges pinning the massive concrete lid. Metal screamed against metal. The sound ricocheted off the empty hills. "That's it!" Alva shouted over the noise, flipping his welding mask up. "Hinges are fully severed. Hit the winch." Dylan threw himself into the Jeep. Engine roaring, he engaged the winch. The steel cable snapped rigid with a sickening twang, vibrating under impossible tension. For one long, agonizing minute, nothing. The engine howled, tires slipped and clawed at the dirt. Then a sound like a rifle shot split the air. Crack! A plume of 100-year-old dust erupted from the seam. A rancid breath of stale air and old machine oil hissed up from the darkness beneath. Slowly, inch by grinding inch, the massive capstone tilted upward. It rose to reveal a gaping, pitch-black void. Alva and Dylan stood at the edge of the open shaft. Their high-powered LED flashlights punched through swirling dust. The beams revealed a spiral staircase, forged from heavy iron, corkscrewing deep into the bedrock below. Cold air drifted up, carrying the scent of rust, dry earth, and something faintly metallic, almost sweet. "You ready for this?" Dylan asked. He checked the battery on his flashlight, clipped a dual gas detector to his belt. "I've been ready since the day Richard laughed in my face," Alva said. He grabbed a heavy crowbar, took the first step down. The iron groaned beneath his weight, but held. They descended without a word. The temperature plummeted with each revolution of the stairs. 30 feet down, the staircase ended abruptly. Their boots hit solid ground, damp cobblestone, laid in intricate geometric patterns. Alva swept his flashlight across a cavernous space. His breath caught hard in his throat. This wasn't a bunker. It was a subterranean cathedral of industry. The cavern had started as limestone, nature's work, but someone had poured a fortune into reshaping it. Massive steel arches braced the walls. Brickwork lined every surface with obsessive precision. Yet none of that mattered. None of it registered, because sitting in the center of that underground cathedral, resting on a length of perfectly preserved narrow-gauge track, was a full-size Pullman luxury railcar, a ghost from the Gilded Age. Painted deep midnight blue, so dark it swallowed light. Gold leaf trim ran along its flanks in intricate scrollwork, catching their flashlight beams like frozen fire. On the side, the Vanguard Railway Corporation crest, and beneath it, spelled out in elegant gold lettering, a name: the Gilded Sovereign. "My God," Dylan whispered. He moved toward the machine slowly, reverently. Alva, Elias Vanguard didn't just hide his money, he buried his personal armored rail car. He must have run a spur line of the main mountain pass, drove the car straight into the cavern, then collapsed the tunnel entrance behind him, from the inside. Alva walked to the side door of the Pullman car. The handle was brass, tarnished black by decades of dead air. He wrapped both hands around it, planted his boots against the train's side panel, pulled with everything his body had. The mechanism screamed, fought him, then surrendered with a sharp metallic crack. The heavy door swung wide. He climbed inside. His flashlight cut through interior darkness thick as velvet curtains. Even under the suffocating layer of dust, the luxury was staggering. Mahogany paneling, velvet upholstered chairs, crystal decanters still locked upright in their brass racks. But the opulence meant nothing, not compared to what filled the rear half of the car. Row after row of heavy iron-bound wooden crates, stacked floor to ceiling, packed tight as a vault. Alva approached the nearest crate. The wood had gone brittle. Decades of stale, motionless air had drained every drop of moisture from the grain. He wedged his crowbar beneath the lid, threw his weight against it. The wood splintered apart, the lid crashing to the floor of the train car. He pointed his light inside. His knees buckled. He went down hard. Vision blurring, hands trembling so violently the flashlight nearly slipped from his fingers. Gold. Not coins, not trinkets. Massive, uniform bullion bars stamped with the insignia of the U.S. Treasury, dated 1928. Hundreds of them. The dull, heavy yellow gleam threw warm light back against his face. Surreal, impossible, undeniable. Dylan rushed up behind him, stopped dead. He choked. Alva breathed. He moved to the next row. These containers weren't wood, sealed zinc. He pried the top off one and found stacks of paper, perfectly preserved in the dry, oxygen-starved air. He pulled out a bundle. Bearer bonds, uncirculated gold certificates in massive denominations, effectively untraceable, fully valid. The wealth sitting beneath the worthless dirt of the Ashwood tract was beyond calculation. Enough to buy Richard's company 10 times over and liquidate it for sport. Absolute, world-shifting power. Alva laughed, a breathless, hysterical sound that ricocheted through the empty train car. Uncle Harrison hadn't been senile, he had been a genius. Somehow he had discovered the location of Vanguard's lost train, bought the land above it quietly, then left the greatest treasure of the 20th century to the one person in the family who didn't care about money. Alva! Dylan's voice cut through the euphoria, tight, panicked. He was staring out the Pullman car's window, up toward the open shaft in the cavern roof. What? Alva asked, still gripping a gold bar. Look up. Alva stepped out of the train car, tilted his head toward the shaft. The sky above, which should have been deepening to twilight purple, was strobing. Aggressive, violent pulses of red and blue light. The heavy crunch of tires rolling over gravel echoed down the shaft. Then the slam of car doors. One after another. Alva Caldwell. The voice boomed down the tunnel, amplified through a megaphone. This is Sheriff Miller of Oak Haven County. We have a court-ordered cease and desist. Step away from the excavation immediately and come up with your hands visible. Then a second voice filtered down the shaft. No megaphone needed, just pure, dripping arrogance. Richard. I told you, Alva. Richard's words bounced off the stone walls into the black. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 53, underscore, underscore, underscore. Alva stood motionless in the dark, the gold bar dragging at his arm like an anchor. The first wave of panic burned off. What replaced it was something colder, something he'd never felt before. For years he had kept his head down, swallowed the jokes, absorbed the insults, endured the patronizing tone like it was weather he couldn't change. But standing inside the barrier chamber of Elias' Vanguard, surrounded by the currency of empires, Alva understood something had shifted permanently. He wasn't the quiet, broken history teacher anymore. He was gripping the keys to the kingdom. And he was going to demolish Richard Gallagher with them. Sirens screamed from the surface, their wail bleeding down the iron shaft like a dispatch from hell itself. Alva stood rigid inside the opulent, dust-strangled Pullman car, that heavy bullion bar still pressed into his palm. The sheer gall of Richard's appearance had obliterated the wonder of his discovery, replaced it with something harder, something made of ice and steel. Dylan was unraveling. The engineer lurched toward the train car's exit, his flashlight beam ricocheting off the vaulted limestone overhead. Alva, we need to go up. If that's the county sheriff, they'll charge us with resisting. They'll seal the shaft, impound my jeep. We lose everything. Be quiet, Alva said. The edge in his own voice caught him off guard. The man who'd spent a lifetime dodging confrontation was gone, buried somewhere in the soil above their heads. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 56, underscore, underscore. Alva lowered the gold bar back into the splintered wooden crate. Too heavy, too obvious. No one climbs a 30-foot vertical ladder with 40 pounds of federal bullion stuffed in a jacket. He turned instead to the sealed zinc boxes. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 57, underscore, underscore. Alva said, jamming his crowbar into the seam of a second metal container. Dylan froze for half a heartbeat, then threw his full weight onto the handle alongside Alva. The seal surrendered with a metallic groan. Inside, stacked with military precision and wrapped in oilcloth, lay bundles of high-denomination gold certificates and uncirculated bearer bonds from the 1920s. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 58, underscore, underscore. Alva ordered, scooping fistfuls of a century-old financial instruments and cramming them into the deep pockets of his heavy canvas work jacket. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 59, underscore, underscore. Dylan fumbled his phone free, hands trembling, and started a high-definition sweep of the underground cavern. Alva, meanwhile, loaded his pockets methodically until the heavy canvas pulled taut at the seams. These bonds were effectively cash, bearer instruments belonging to whoever physically possessed them. Untraceable, completely legal, worth an obscene fortune to any private collector or federal institution. Sheriff Miller's voice exploded through the megaphone, slamming off the cavern walls. "We're coming up!" Alva called back, his words spiraling up the shaft. He met Dylan's eyes and gave one firm nod. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 62, underscore, underscore, underscore. The ascent up the spiral iron staircase stretched into an eternity. Each step fed Alva's mind another piece of a forming strategy. When his head finally broke the surface, the searing white blast of police spotlights struck him like a fist. 3 Oak Haven County sheriff's cruisers sat in a ragged circle around the excavation site. Red and blue light bars slashed the dead landscape in harsh, aggressive sweeps. 6 deputies stood with hands resting on holstered sidearms, casual menace, well rehearsed. And behind them all, draped in a tailored cashmere overcoat, wearing a smirk of total victory, stood Richard Gallagher. Next to him stood a heavy-set, perspiring figure Alva recognized from campaign signs plastered across the county. Commissioner Sterling. __quote _63 __. Richard sneered, stepping toward Alva as he hauled himself over the concrete capstone's edge, Dylan right behind him. Look what the rats dragged up. I warned you, Alva. Should have taken the 10,000 when it was on the table. Sheriff Miller moved forward. Thick neck.
Cold eyes.
Alva Caldwell, you are under arrest for violating County Environmental Ordinance 402, operating heavy machinery without a permit, and disturbing a protected watershed. Turn around, hands behind your back. A watershed? Alva's voice was remarkably even as he turned, letting the cold handcuffs clamp down on his wrists. Commissioner Sterling cut in, smooth as oil, pressing a silk handkerchief to his glistening forehead. Alva sat flatly, his gaze locked on Richard. Richard leaned close. His cologne hung cloyingly sweet in the cool night air. __quote _72 __. They searched him, but they were hunting for weapons, not documents. The deputies passed right over the thick bundles of stiff oilcloth-wrapped paper stuffed inside his work jacket, dismissed them as insulation or gloves. Alva and Dylan were shoved into the back of a cruiser. As it rolled away from the Ashwood tract, Alva pressed his face to the barred window. Richard was already ordering Victor Lawson to erect a perimeter fence around the open shaft. They believed they'd won. Believed they'd outmaneuvered the pathetic history teacher. Alva spent the night on a metal bench inside a concrete holding cell at Oak Haven County Jail. Sleep never came. He sat rigid, hands resting on his jacket, fingers tracing the crinkle of bearer bonds hidden within the lining. 6 in the morning. The heavy steel door groaned open. Sarah stood in the corridor, eyes raw from tears, jaw set like iron. She'd emptied their thin savings to make bail. What happened? She whispered as they stepped into the cold morning air. Richard called the house. Said you lost the land. Said you're facing felony charges for environmental destruction. Alva stopped on the sidewalk and pulled her close. Richard is a liar, he breathed into her ear. He has no idea what he just set in motion. He didn't go home, drove straight to the bank, locked the bearer bonds in a safety deposit box, and pulled out 2 of the smaller gold certificates. Then he bought a train ticket to Manhattan. He needed a predator, the kind of attorney who devoured corporate bullies before lunch. A recommendation from a well-connected parent at his school led him to the glass-walled, ultra-modern office of Victoria Hayes. Victoria was a legal force of nature in New York. Former federal prosecutor turned private litigator. Her specialty was high-stakes asset recovery and corporate warfare. She sat behind a desk of solid white marble, razor-sharp in a designer suit, her eyes moving over the grainy photographs Dylan had taken inside the vault. She'd heard Alva's entire account without a single interruption. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the precision of a surgical blade. Victoria said, placing the photos down. Alva said. Victoria lifted one of the gold certificates from her desk. She held it up to the light, studying the watermarks. Code 80, Code 81. A slow, predatory smile crept across Victoria Hayes' face. Mr. Caldwell, do you have any idea what happens when local county officials attempt to seize federal property using fabricated civil statutes? Alva shook his head. The federal government brings down a hammer so massive it obliterates the entire county, Victoria said, rising to her feet and buttoning her jacket. Richard Gallagher believes he's playing local checkers, We're about to drag him into federal chess, but we need to move before he figures out what's actually sitting at the bottom of that hole. The emergency injunction hearing came 3 days later, inside the oak-paneled courtroom of the Oak Haven County Courthouse. Every seat was taken. News of a massive mineral discovery on the Ashwood Tract had leaked, almost certainly by Richard himself, pumping his company stock. The Gallagher family clustered in the gallery, whispering with barely contained excitement. Beatrice, Richard's wife, offered Alva a pitying little wave as he entered with Sarah, condescension dripping from her fingers. Richard occupied the plaintiff's table, bracketed by 3 high-priced corporate attorneys. He looked like a man waiting for his coronation. Judge Sterling, cousin to the very Commissioner Sterling who had engineered the seizure, presided from the bench. Bored, entirely compliant. Alva sat alone at the defense table. Victoria Hayes had given him one instruction. "Wait." "Court is in session," Judge Sterling intoned, dropping his gavel with barely any conviction. "Be convened to rule on the county's emergency motion for eminent domain over the Ashwood Tract, currently held by Mr. Alva Caldwell. The county alleges severe environmental negligence. Counselor, proceed." Richard's lead attorney rose, smoothing his tie. Judge Sterling muttered, reaching for his pen. The injunction order sat right in front of him. The heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom crashed open. That bang ricocheted off the high ceilings. Every voice in the room died instantly. Victoria Hayes came down the center aisle. She moved with the raw, undeniable momentum of a storm front, heels striking the hardwood like gunshots. Flanking her walked 4 men in dark suits, gold badges gleaming on their lapels. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Behind them, 2 agents in windbreakers stamped with the United States Department of the Treasury. __quote _90 __. Victoria's voice filled the room, absolute, commanding, leaving no space for objection. "I am Victoria Hayes, legal counsel for Mr. Alva Caldwell, and you are about to sign an illegal document that constitutes a federal crime." Judge Sterling's pen clattered to the desk. The color drained from his face. __quote